A quick look at the history of Germany's top league, the Bundesliga, shows that no team has ever really matched the type of run that Bayern Munich is on right now, having won every title since 2013. Obviously, there have been contributing factors, in no small part that's helped out a little bit. But as you survey the history, no team has matched Bayern Munich at all, except there is one team in Germany that has. And you know how Bayern Munich just seems to steal players from other German teams? Well, this team actually stole an entire team from another team. And it didn't happen that long ago. At least according to the analytics on YouTube, some of you were alive when this was going on. Because I'm talking about a club called BFC Dynamo. Something. BFC Dynamo won 10 straight championships in Germany. They won it in a Liga. They just won it in the East German DDR Oberliga. And if you think Bayern Munich bullies their league now, you haven't seen anything yet. In case you were curious, this club still exists today, just not quite at the same level. Maybe they should just subscribe to this channel, then they'll get back to the Bundesliga. Works every time, 100%. BFC's dominance was born out of the specific situation going on in East Germany at the time. And if you're wondering why I'm saying East Germany, little history lesson, Germany used to be divided in two between West Germany, which is this side, and then East Germany, which is over here. And if you've ever wondered why all of the good teams in the Bundesliga don't seem to be from Berlin, except for Union Berlin this year, congratulations in the Champions League. That's because East Germany's club system and footballing culture developed in a different way and was kind of strangled by BFC. And also because East Germany wasn't necessarily as interested in investing in it. See, East Germany was part of the Iron Curtain during the Cold War, and that meant that the East German government was interested in creating propaganda from sports to try and promote the successful way of life they had. Now, the easiest way to do this was investing in the Olympics. And even though soccer is an Olympic sport, it costs a lot of money to train up a fully competent team to compete in the Olympics at a high level to win medals, where if you happen to train up one swimmer, for example, they could win multiple medals, and that works much better for propaganda purposes. The result is that countries under the Iron Curtain, and East Germany is included in this, really had a standardized way of developing Olympic athletes as a sort of medal-winning propaganda machine in individual sports and women's sports. And that was just a lot easier to do than even compete for European Cups in the club sport because, well, in that situation, you're competing against the richest clubs in the world with the best coaches and the best facilities, something that they couldn't attract or afford. Or on the flip side, in the Olympics, your opponents were amateur. It was a fully amateur event at the time, so even though East German Olympic athletes were amateur, they weren't. They trained all the time. It was much easier to win. The lack of money in coaching didn't give kids the opportunity to develop either. In this research paper by McDougall, they said they didn't have enough cleats, soccer boots, they didn't have lights, or any decent facilities. But rather curiously, East Germany, over the first couple of years of its existence, devised a way to pay players without actually paying them. They would just give them the nice stuff, the luxury goods that you couldn't get in East Germany otherwise. Or as is referred to, they were shamateur. Amateur in name, but compensated nonetheless. They also were allowed to travel outside the country, which was a big deal. And it was on the wave of this burgeoning class of actually professional football players in East Germany for the first time that BFC Dynamo was born. And this was not a club that was created and slowly climbed its way to the top. There's no Luton Town story here, because this was the club that was run by the Ministry for State Security. It had another name, the Stasi. This is the East German equivalent of the KGB. And in 1954, the club that would be BFC Dynamo was created as SC Dynamo Berlin. And they stole the entire team of SC Dynamo Dresden. You see, the Stasi and other East German officials wanted to give Berlin a top-level team, and the way they decided to do that is by literally taking the first-place team and just moving it somewhere else. As this article puts it, unilateral transfers were the name of the game in a bid to create teams that could potentially rival their Western counterparts for propaganda purposes. The head of the Stasi, Erich Milke, said football success will highlight even more clearly the superiority of our socialist order in the area of sport. That is not the last time we will hear from Erich Milke in this story. Now, as you might imagine, stealing an entire team from Dresden didn't work out as well as they clearly thought it would. The team finished 7th in their first year in the top league of East Germany, and actually finished behind another team from Berlin. That would be ASK Verwarts Berlin, but they aren't exactly blameless in this either, because they stole their entire team from a club called Vorwärts Leipzig. There's a common theme here. The idea actually for 20 years was a giant miserable failure. Vorwärts Berlin won the title 6 times, while BFC didn't win it once. Even Dynamo Dresden, who BFC stole their entire team from, won the title multiple times up through the 70s. And from 76 to 78, Dynamo Dresden won 3 consecutive titles. You see, over this period from 1953 to 1978, Erich Mielke, the head of the Stasi, had taken on a bigger and bigger role at the club. And by the time we get to 1978, he is the honorary chairman of BFC Dynamo. And I want you to remember, he is a KGB leading style secret police madman. So the quote I'm about to read has that behind it. After Dynamo Dresden's 3rd title, he said in 1978, it was BFC Dynamo's turn. And thus, Die Schiebemeister, the cheating champion, was crowned for a first time. Because from 1979 to 1988, BFC Dynamo won 10 consecutive East German championships, each one seemingly more controversial than the last. And every source on this describes the key influence behind all that as Erich Mielke. He is a football-mad Stasi chief, and he wanted the team he was a chairman of to win. He also made sure that they basically always had the best players, coaches, and facilities because he could just do that. He wasn't the only one doing it, though. He was just doing it bigger and better than everybody else because all the local party bosses were sponsoring the other clubs. In fact, basically every club in the entire league was sponsored by a particular individual or by a particular state institution, as was very common in the Iron Curtain days. The main reason behind the state sponsorship was to provide a sort of popular legitimacy to the different institutions of the state itself. Looking at you, Newcastle. Hi. How are you? But even though everybody was trying to do it, the entirety of the East German Federation united slowly but reliably in hatred for BFC Dynamo. And part of that was that the club's fan base, despite 10 consecutive league titles, was actually quite small. It was made up of Stasi employees and the hooligans that went with them. Oh, and they also just, randomly got good players on other teams arrested. For example, in 1981, 2 players that were very good on Dynamo Dresden, Weber and Müller, were both arrested on suspicion of attempting to leave East Germany and never played high-level soccer again. There was a notorious offside goal that was apparently so bad in BFC's favor that East German television decided to never show the replay, ever. But the most famous example was in 1986, with a team that had already won 7 consecutive titles. In 1986, Lokomotiv Leipzig was challenging for the title and leading a match 1-0 the entire way into stoppage time when a BFC forward threw himself to the ground in the box and got a penalty call. The reaction of the radio commentator, because of how bad it looked, was, and I quote, "This cannot be happening." It's an event that is known around the country as the penalty of shame, and the uproar from the public itself was so intense they had to actually ban the referee from refereeing for life in order to quell the uproar. The stoppage time penalty was obviously scored, and BFC Dynamo went on to win its 8th consecutive title. Now, the hatred of BFC Dynamo was most apparent when they would play against Union Berlin, which was considered the people's club of the time. Union Berlin supporters would show up with banners that said things like, "We welcome BFC Dynamo and their referees." They would also start chants like, "We don't want no Stasi swine," which would obviously lead to mass arrests. And there were instances of huge brawls in the stands where entire benches would be ripped out between the 2 different fan bases, the Stasi and the People's Club. This was not a situation that could go on forever, and if you know anything historically about the 80s, the Iron Curtain was beginning to fall and things were starting to break apart in areas like East Germany. And even Erich Mielke couldn't keep his team together. On an away day in 1983 against Partizan Belgrade, he actually started losing players. They flew to Belgrade on Erich Mielke's airplane, the head of the Stasi's airplane, but when the players went on a tour of the city, a couple of them, Falco Gürtsch and Dirk Schlegel, actually snuck into a cab and took it to the West German embassy to claim asylum. The way the club handled this at the time is they said that Gürtsch and Schlegel had received huge offers with a ton of money from Western clubs, and they betrayed their own club instead. But really, they were just trying to get out of East Germany. And the players weren't the only ones that that were leaving, the fans were leaving too. The predictability of BFC's title runs really hurt the development of East German football, and maybe one of the biggest contributing reasons to the lack of East German teams that now are able to compete in the larger full German Bundesliga. Because BFC somewhat cheating their way to 10 straight titles didn't necessarily turn them into a European power. They made a semi-final in 1972 in the Cup Winners' Cup. They made a quarterfinal in the European Cup in 1980, but that was it. East German fans actually by the end preferred supporting West German teams in the first place, and the average attendance in the final season of the East German League was below 5,000 per game. BFC Dynamo's 10-year run of championships ended in 1989. Dynamo Dresden won the next two, and then Hansa Rostock won the final title in that weird last year. At which time the teams were distributed into the full West German League system when Germany reunified, and BFC, because it finished freaking 11th in the final year because the Stasi's power itself was waning, ended up in the third league of Germany, when just 4 years earlier it was on a 10-year championship run. And that was just the beginning of the hard times, because when you are the former club of the Stasi, it's not exactly easy to attract sponsors. And all East German clubs in general struggled from the fact that they were sponsored by failing government institutions that essentially couldn't help them anymore, and they had to learn how to apply capitalism to a sport that they just had never applied capitalism to before. As for Milky, he was put on trial in 1989 for embezzlement and died in 2000, but was not able to help the club anymore essentially after 1989. And a year after his death, the club actually filed for insolvency. And the club has continued to have image problems up to today. While researching this, we ran into a very complex part of their history, where in the late 80s, as communism and the Iron Curtain was starting to fail, the way to counteract that far left sentiment was to be extremely far right. And a large number of the hooligans that supported BFC Dynamo were becoming very far right as a means of rebellion against the far left government under which they live. But once that becomes not an act of rebellion and just the people that support your club, that is obviously a problem. As the team plummeted down the leagues, the crowds disappeared. Soon, only a hardcore of a few hundred remained, many drawn from a right-leaning milieu, establishing a reputation which plagues the club to this day. Now, to their credit, they seem to have come out of this. The chairman acknowledged that 25 years ago, if you wanted to consider BFC a very right-wing club, he would have agreed with you, but now that's not the case, and the club actually has really integrated itself into the community and runs a daycare for a couple of hundred kids and all this great stuff. It now plays in the 4th division with its incredibly complex past and massive collection of trophies. A very fleeting memory. But what is perhaps most remarkable is that the only club that can hold a candle to Bayern Munich's dominance in Germany at any time is just another local club now. And that's less than 40 years after its last title. If you want to hang out with me, I stream live. I'll see you on Twitch. The link is down in the description. And if you want any of the sources from this video, all of our research is of course linked down in the description as well. May I recommend the 11 Pigs and the Secret Police, the story of BFC Dynamo, that does a great job of overviewing most of the things that we have talked about here. You can also save that for later and keep binge watching. This is a video about a goalkeeper who scored more goals than Zinedine Zidane. True story. Like, I'm not kidding. And it's not all penalties either. I'm not lying to you.